Okay, so in this section, I want to mention a couple of efforts by largely Australian national governments to try to mitigate the climatic effects of human behavior here in Australia. There are a bunch of other ones. I could talk about individual level responses to try to encourage the consumption of ugly fruit or freegans in Canberra, but I want to focus on some of the major governmental efforts that have been, in some ways, politically driven or individually driven, politically sensitive or toxic or not. Some of the efforts really kind of show what is possible and what's going on in Australia can be related to but distinct from what's going on in other parts of the world. So, one way to try to mitigate is try to reduce energy consumption using those fossil fuels as we saw in one of the previous slides, ACT trying to move to non fossil fuel consumption for energy generation here in the ACT. One of the ways to do that is through installed solar capacity, and you can see quite a dramatic growth. The Y scale is logged, and because the graph otherwise down at the bottom kind of shows this huge dramatic uptick in the last decade in solar capacity, but this kind of shows the relative change over time a bit more clearly, with China outpacing the US for solar installations as of about 2010, while Australia is fourth in the world for solar installations. That quite dramatically increased over the last 15 years or so here in Australia and in other parts of the world. You see this huge dramatic spike in Brazil just within the last decade as well, from pretty much zero. So you can see how these mitigation efforts and the energy consumption efforts could dramatically decrease the use of the kind of fossil fuels that we talked about in the last week, but then also prove challenging to the existing quite expensive infrastructure that's been used in order to generate electricity, and they require some kind of technical solutions as well to try to combine these kind of efforts and to kind of ease this transition. One of the ways to do that is through private markets, through venture capital funds, to try to encourage innovation by individual companies. You can see here in the most recent data that I was able to find from 2014 that clean transportation, not necessarily solar panel installations, energy generation here is only 12%, but clean transportation through electric vehicles, electric trucks, those kind of things would take over half of the funding as of about 7 or 8 years ago. So you can see dramatic increase in some of them, but that's potentially different to where the funding is going in the private sector. Connecting back to government efforts for a second, I think cap and trade systems and carbon taxes are those that are often talked about because in some graphs, I don't think I have them here, transportation produces roughly 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And one way to try to do that is something that we've seen Australia use a bit, but then California has passed one of the more visible ones. In 2013, they passed a cap and trade system that allows corporations a limit for how much pollution is able to be produced every year, and that overall level of allowable pollution decreases by 3%. So the overall level is decreased, and so if you're more efficient in your processes and you don't generate as much, you can trade that extra ability to pollute to another corporation who hasn't been able to bring down that production, so you can cap and trade that process. And you can see here with California, there's the fourth largest in the world after China, EU, and South Korea. You can have this gradual actual decrease and projected decreases over time that would be able to mitigate the production, as well as potentially adapt to changing availability or cost of resources. There's a lot of these things, but I think the important takeaway is to try to to appreciate the different actors that try to come up with different solutions, and the importance of national governments to be able to pass policies that can force individual behavior or corporate behavior to try to adapt to changing situations, which kind of leads me to putting a price in on carbon. The number of countries and regional efforts to try to price carbon to reflect the actual cost that it has in the environment and to decrease the incentive for use has dramatically increased from 2012 to 2019, from 20 to 57. You can actually go, the World Bank has a carbon price dashboard which looks at carbon pricing initiatives in California and the East Coast, in Europe, in China, Kazakhstan, Argentina, South Africa. There's a whole bunch of different regions around the world that are trying to experiment with carbon pricing, and there's a lot of research and press on these kind of efforts as well. These values are a couple years old now, but they're the most recent that I was able to find in the Northeast, where I went to grad school. The price per metric ton of CO2 is cheaper than California by a factor of third, and those don't cover that cost of the CO2 emissions. Only covers 18% of emissions in the Northeast, while 85% in California. Canada, they have higher prices, and it ranges by province. Up to 90% of the emissions are actually covered. In Australia, we do have that initiative by the current government that does put a price on certain amounts of CO2, but the coverage is according to this, the estimates are more limited. However, overall, as a global framework, these things have gone quite dramatically up from the amount of emissions in the countries that produce them, up to over 20% of global greenhouse emissions are now covered by some kind of carbon tax or emissions trading systems. So ones in which you have taxes implemented by some kind of government agency, for the emissions trading would be more like that cap and trade system that I talked about with California as well. Carbon taxes can be politically tendentious in a number of different areas, Australia especially. I'm not sure how much you might have covered in your other classes the Australia's experience with carbon taxes, but for those of you who aren't familiar, I think this is interesting to show how these initiatives can change according to political realities, which is why this is a political science class. Australia's first tax was the first explicit national tax on carbon emissions. The tax level was $23 US dollars per metric ton. So one of the highest in the world. I showed you that slide a bit earlier that ranges between $5 to $30 in the US to Canada. It was that tax was right before it was repealed in 2014. That repeal was also precedent setting, and it garnered a lot more global attention, as well as some blowback in some of the international agreements and meetings when trying to talk about global coordinated efforts to try to reduce levels. The government would say that the emissions cap and trade scheme would be as important. A couple of elements from this timeline of this carbon tax, connecting also back to international efforts, which we're going to be talking about next week. Australia refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. The UK started one of the earliest emissions trading schemes in 2002 and then joined the EU one in 2005. John Howard then, 5 years later, proposed an emissions trading scheme for Australia. After the election and Labour came into office, the new Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, ratified the Kyoto Protocol a decade after it had been introduced. In 2008, Rudd also announced a cap and trade system, but it was voted down twice in 2009, shelved it in 2010 due to Senate opposition. Carbon tax did pass in 2011 and began under the new Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, in 2012. Rudd came back, as you all know, and planned to terminate the tax and replace it with an emission trading scheme, kind of like what he initially proposed years earlier. After, of course, Labour lost the election, the carbon tax was quickly repealed by the new coalition government. And so this is kind of shows how difficult it can be to make long-term policy given switches in national or subnational level government. I wanted to show you a quick graph to show the effect that this brief carbon tax did have in reducing quite dramatically the fossil fuel emissions from electricity generation. Went down by almost 20%. In 2 years, and then after it repealed, it came up, but never quite to where it was before. And then fossil fuels as a percentage of electricity generation is still quite dramatically declined in those years since, often because the prices of alternative renewable resources have come down to the point where that they're economically competitive or more cheap. So you do see that quite dramatic decline, as well as specifically the types of fuel type. The black coal and the brown coal had the most dramatic decline, but you still over time you see that slow, steady increase in solar installation and wind installation that wasn't really as susceptible to those kind of government policies, potentially just because it was seen as more of an economic investment by those corporations that were building them, or individuals deciding to install them, or potential local governments providing incentives like in South Australia or in the ACT. But you do see that quite dramatic change. And then just try to connect it to the individual level impact on how much we actually paid. You can see how much electricity prices went up in the years before the carbon price, and in the carbon price decreased afterwards as the coal-fired power plants, of course, became cheaper to run because they didn't have to pay the tax. As well as you see this flexibility. This goes up to the estimates only go up through the values go up through 2018, the estimates go up after that, but I would willing to bet in the last year or two you've also seen an increase in the amounts there. So you can see a couple of examples through emissions trading schemes, carbon prices, efforts at a national level and subnational level to be able to mitigate the effects of human behavior on the environment through trying to encourage different kinds of energy generation or behaviors that would produce different amounts of CO2 emissions. So with that, let's go ahead and turn now to tying mitigation and adaptation to national security. Yep. And then we'll watch a couple of videos, people talking about the case specifically related to Nepal. So let's start to connect it to national security, things that we've talked about related to conflict so far this term.